we're all present, so we need to go ahead and get started. You may wonder about our crew back here. Mr. M.D. Smith, who is a graduate of Indian Springs School, wanted to come in and tape a presentation for this class. For whose benefit, I'm not sure, M.D., you...
In the school archive.
in the school archive. So all of you look good, be sharp, and we'll see if we can get through this thing together. Now, let me make a couple of comments before I launch into what we're going to be covering today. The main job that we're going to try to achieve today are the events that actually led up to the American entry into World War II. And we will conclude with the attack on Pearl Harbor and show how that developed and why it developed the way that it did. Then tomorrow we'll move on then, of course, into the first couple of years of the war. You've already got your study questions on that, and so be sure to be prepared to get into that in considerable detail on Thursday, because we'll try to finish that up at that time. Let me back up for just a moment now and set the stage for what we want to get into today. One of the things that you will remember, one other thing, I better remind you of this. Don't forget that there's a short paper due at the end of the semester. Several of you have already indicated what your interests are and what you're working on. If you're one of the people like Sam who's not too sure about what he wants to do, be sure to drop by and see me, and I'll be very glad to give you some pointers. Yes?
What kind of references?
Well, just standard references. I'm not assuming, now this isn't a term paper per se. In other words, I'm not expecting 15 or 20 references or anything like that. Probably 3 or 4 would be quite adequate for the short paper I want you to do. And it could be something on the current scene. You could research Iraq if you wanted to, or it could be something from the American Revolution. You just be the choice of that. That's no problem. But if you have questions, by all means, come in and see me. All right, what I want to do today then, as I've said, is to build up to the attack on Pearl Harbor and try to give you some idea about why this attack was such a complete surprise. It's pretty obvious in retrospect, and of course we're all geniuses after the fact, it's pretty obvious in retrospect that we should have seen this coming. There should have been some preparation for it. But I would remind you that we should have perhaps seen what was about to happen on 9/11, and yet that sneaked up on us in a rather unhappy fashion also. So this wasn't the first or the last time we'll probably be caught flat-footed. So we'll go back now and run through the build-up then for the Japanese attack. I don't think we need, because we've already been over this, to remind you of all of the things that indicated that the world scene was becoming a very dangerous place. During the 1920s, it looked like that maybe things were going to work out reasonably well, because we had a very prosperous period. Germany, it looked like the Weimar Republic was going to make it. In Japan, some liberal statesmen were selected to run the government, and it looked like things were going to work out pretty well. Although the United States had made one terrible mistake. I think most diplomatic historians would say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the biggest diplomatic mistake we made. Right after World War I, what did we fail to do?
Join the League of Nations. Join the League of Nations.
Exactly. We failed to ratify the Treaty of Versailles and join the League of Nations. As a result, the most powerful state in the world is on the sideline, so to speak. Now, during the 20s, it didn't seem like that would make much difference, but then came the Depression. And the only person who had come to power at that time who would be regarded later as an aggressor was Mussolini. But during the 20s, Mussolini was relatively quiet in Italy. You remember reading about how many people referred to him as the man who made the Italian trains run on time, something that most people thought Italian trains would never be able to do, but they did under Mussolini. He also began to rearm Italy, but Italy by herself would not pose that much of a threat to anybody. And as a consequence of that, we got to the end of the 20s, and things were looking reasonably sound at that stage of the game. Now let's see where the disasters began. With the coming of the Depression, the first group that suffered from it were the liberal Japanese statesmen in Japan. they began to be replaced by military leaders. And ultimately, of course, the military had taken over the Japanese government by 1931. And the result of that was that the Japanese decided that they were not going to recover from this terrible depression unless they had additions to their colonial empire. And where did they decide to strike? Where did the Japanese in 1931 try to make an addition to their colonial empire? Where did they turn?
The Philippines?
Not the Philippines. That was a little bit later on. Yeah, they gobbled them up 10 years later.
Manchuria?
Manchuria. The Chinese government had unraveled pretty badly after the emperor had been overthrown at the beginning of the 20th century. And in effect, it was run by, well, historians at the time referred to them as the warlords. Division commanders who controlled the various provinces pretty much took them over and ran them anywhere they wanted to. The central government's authority was almost nil. And one of the provinces that was close to Japan, bordering Korea, which the Japanese had already annexed back in 1911, the Japanese decided to move into Manchuria. It was reputed to have a lot of mineral resources, and it did. But there was one mineral resource they could not find there, and it was going to come back to be very important later on. That was oil. There was plenty of coal, iron ore. They could produce steel there, but one of the things you have to have in order to prosecute modern war is a dependable supply of petroleum, and it simply was not discovered in Manchuria at that time. The irony of it is that later on they did discover some oil there, but they did not have the technology to do it at that point in time. Now, the institution that was supposed to deal with this kind of problem was the League of Nations. I've told you already about how the incident that started the affair, you remember a train was supposed to be running through Manchuria. The Japanese owned the rail line. What was supposed to happen, Floyd?
The train was supposed to derail because of a bad signal.
That's right. But the people who sabotaged the rails blew up such a small section of track, these boys really needed some training, that the train jumped the little gap and went right on to Mukden like it was supposed to. But the Japanese had 250,000 men who were told to march at 4 o'clock in the morning. Well, what are you going to do? They sent the men forward, and then they came in later and showed foreign reporters, well, this is the reason we attacked. They've blown up this little section of track, and so we're coming in to restore order. That was always the aggressors' word. All right. So they took over Manchuria, and nothing happened. That is, the League of Nations took no action against them. The United States, of course, isn't even in the League. We paid very little attention to it. And so the first aggressive act has been taken. Then a little bit later on, Mussolini decided that he needed to expand the Italian colonial empire, and in 1935 he invaded Ethiopia. And, of course, in 8 months overran that country. The Ethiopians had beaten them in an earlier war, but that was before the tank and the plane and heavy artillery came along. And, of course, the Ethiopians didn't have a prayer the next time the Italians attacked. Now, the most important person in regards to all of these problems was, of course, Hitler. And Hitler had formed the Nazi Party, and when the Depression hit, his party began to gain seats in the Reichstag, until finally by 1933 he had the largest number of seats. He did not have a majority, but he did have the largest number of seats in the Reichstag. And finally the president, Hindenburg, decided that in order to quiet things down in Germany, he did not see, of course, how dangerous Hitler was, and decided to make him chancellor. Now the key point here was, the minute Hitler became chancellor, that put him in control of the police. And once he got in control of the police, there was almost no way they were going to be able to oust him from power, regardless of what happened. He began rapid rearmament in Germany. You remember under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was supposed to be limited to an army of only 100,000 men. They were supposed to have no air force and a very small navy. Now all that changes. He pushes through one rearmament bill after another, and Germany now becomes a major power. All right, to hasten on. The United States then, in viewing all of these things, was concerned But the thing that concerned us the most was that we began to see the possibility of a war coming, but we wanted to stay out. There had developed in the United States a theory that one of the biggest mistakes we had ever made was getting involved in World War I. It just should not have happened. We should have stayed out, let the Allies and Germany fight it out. It really wasn't our fight anyway. There was an investigation. It was conducted in the 1930s by Gerald Nye, a senator from North Dakota. And his group, in examining how things led up to World War I, or more specifically our entry into it, developed what was called the Merchants of Death theory. The Merchants of Death theory. That the reason the U.S. got involved in the war was not to make the world safe for democracy, as Wilson said. It was to protect the profits made by U.S. Steel and Dow Chemical and all the other big industries that had indeed made a lot of money during the war, because they were trading, of course, with primarily the English and the French. And this theory went on to conclude that the reason we got into war was because when the Germans appeared to be on the verge of victory in early 1918, that these big, powerful companies realized that if the Allies lost, all of that money that was owed to them would be gone. They would never be able to get their money back. And so then this theory said the United States then was lured into attacking or joining the conflict so that these companies get their money back. Now, it's almost laughable to think that was the reason the U.S. went to war today in looking back on it. But I would remind you that that was the way a lot of people saw it at that time. The result was Congress then passed a series of what were called the Neutrality Acts. Beginning in 1935, 36, and 37, they tried to pass laws that would make it virtually impossible for the United States ever to go down that road again. And the best thing for the U.S. to do is stay completely out of things, and that would be the best way to go. Well, all right, very quickly, what happened, of course, you remember, since there was nobody to stop them, the aggressor nations continued on their way. Japanese, after taking Manchuria in 1931-32, then in 1937 launched an attack on the rest of China and pretty much took over most of eastern China. Drove the Chinese nationalists back into the hills and Chongqing in western China, drove the Chinese Communist Army back up into Mongolia in the northern part of the country, and they were almost unstoppable under those circumstances. The Germans, of course, first step Hitler took, 1936, he reoccupied the Rhineland. He moved in there. You remember under the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans were not supposed to have any fortifications or any armed forces between the Rhineland, that's the river in Germany, and the Franco-German border. That was supposed to be left completely free of troops, of German troops. He sent his troops in there, 1936. Hitler himself later told some people that if the French had reacted, if they had sent their army in like they could have done under the Treaty of Versailles, that probably he would have fallen from power. One of the saddest pages in German history is the French didn't send their armed forces in, and so, of course, Hitler's hold over Germany was even stronger than ever. All right, after that, it moved in very rapid paces toward World War II. The first thing that Hitler decided was that Austria, which was an independent German-speaking nation, of course, that he should occupy Austria. He did so without firing a shot, so the first big aggressive step is successful. Then he told Europe that the section of Czechoslovakia that was peopled primarily by Germans, it was called the Sudetenland, should be taken over by Germany. And England and France now began to protest pretty loudly at this point, but they had a meeting at Munich. And what promise did Hitler make to the English and the French, assuming that they permitted him to take the Sudetenland? Christine?
It was his last territorial demand.
This is the last territorial demand that I have to make in Europe. Less than 6 months later, he swallowed the rest of Czechoslovakia. So that pretty well let people know that Hitler was not a man that you could trust very far. All right. Now, in the United States, there were a couple of things that began to happen. We were not entirely comatose. The first big step toward rearmament occurred in 1938. The realization that Japan now has repudiated the naval treaty that they had signed back in the 1920s, and they told everybody out and out, we are going to begin to expand our Navy beyond the limits that we had agreed upon there in the 1920s. The United States then the next year, that was in 1937, in 1938, then the decision was to begin to expand the United States Navy. There were also in 38 some modest increases in the size of the Air Force, but the Army, except for some experimental weapons, pretty much remained out of the picture. Not very much was done. All right, the showdown comes, of course, in 1939. The Japanese, of course, are continuing their aggression against China. They've taken over most of coastal China. In Europe, the Germans, having gobbled up Czechoslovakia, now say that they needed to get territory from Poland. And, of course, this time the French and the English realized he could not be trusted. They told him if he attacked Poland, they would have to declare war. He did attack Poland. They did declare war, and World War II is underway. Now, the United States then had to do a little more soul searching. I would remind you about the Neutrality Acts. I would remind you now about the idea that the United States, above everything, must stay out of any future European or Asian wars. But they began to look at the situation, and one thing became pretty clear to them, that really we would be in a rather dangerous position should France and England go down. And so we decided to review very carefully our Neutrality Acts, and we made a major shift in policy. And the major shift in policy, I won't go through the name of the act that was passed. It's probably best known by the nickname it got, the Cash and Carry Act, the Cash and Carry Act. What that meant was that England and France could get war material from America if they would send their own ships, pay cash on the barrelhead, and then outrun the subs back to Europe. We would do nothing beyond that. That's as far as we would go. Then, the big wake-up call came, of course, in 1940. It was really an incredible scene. The Germans, of course, overran Poland in 6 weeks. That was all over. And Russia, of course, had made a treaty with the Germans, and they took over eastern Poland. Germany took over western Poland. I want to make this observation about Russia right at that time. The Russians, of course, under Stalin, certainly no friend of democratic government. The reason he struck a deal with Hitler was this. He knew that the French and the Germans had built these huge fortifications along their borders. The Germans built the Siegfried Line. The French built the Maginot Line. The assumption of almost all military experts was that these countries would knock their brains out attacking these major fortifications, and then at that point, Russia then, if it stood aside, could step in and dictate the peace. We don't know exactly what was going through Stalin's mind, but we do know that he decided to stand aside. The war broke out. He shared the petition of Poland with Hitler, and I guess, and I made this comment the other day, that it was amazing. Stalin was noted as being a very, very suspicious man who, you remember, purged all of those people that were in the party and the army that he didn't like. And what was the only man in Europe that Stalin appeared to trust? Adolf Hitler, exactly. Not a very wise choice, as we're all well aware. All right, the war is on. In 1940, the Germans astonished the world. In the space of 3 months, and this is almost unbelievable, they took over Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and knocked France out of the war. It happened so fast that most people couldn't even grasp what was going on. The Germans had boasted that they had a new style of warfare, the lightning war, blitzkrieg, and believe me, it worked. With their superior air force and with their armored units, they were able to take over country after country, and it just seemed like with ridiculous ease. There were almost no major battles in which the Germans suffered any losses during that period of time. Now America is fully awake. The decision on the part of the Roosevelt administration was we did not want to be left in a world that was ruled by Germany, Russia, and Japan, and we had no allies. And so we decided to revise our approach to the situation. The first country we felt like we had to slave was England. How were we going to do that without going to war on their side? Well, they took two major steps. The first one was they told the British that we would give them 50 destroyers. We had 50 overage destroyers that were dated from World War I but were still very serviceable in 1940. And in exchange for that, if they would let us fortify some of the British West Indies, British Guiana in South America, and even build a couple of bases up on the Canadian line. If we would do that, then we would, if they would do that, we would give them the 50 destroyers. A lot of people complained. They said this is the first step toward getting into the war. But I think the Roosevelt administration had already concluded something, and that was that regardless of the risks we were running, we simply could not afford to let Britain go down. And that was one of the things then that we tried to do to help them then at this stage of the game. Having done that, the next step was a little easier to take. The Americans decided that, all right, what we need to do is to get rid of the old cash and carry idea. And we developed what was called the Lend, L-E-N-D, the Lend Lease program. The theory was that we were going to lend or lease war material to the English and a little bit later, and I'll get to this in a minute, the Russians. We were going to lend these materials to them, and the advantage of it would be these countries would get these war materials, but they would not have to pay for them. And the second point was there would be no debts built up. If you go back to the 1920s, you remember one of the big debates that was underway was a question about the war debts that the Allies owed the Americans. Well, that would not occur after World War II. There would be no debts. That would be taken care of through the Lend-Lease Act. All right, now let's move up to the American entry into the war. One of the problems that we faced was, in spite of the fact that we had given the British 50 destroyers, the German submarine fleet continued to grow at a very rapid clip. And there was a consensus on the part of many people that we needed to go further than what we had done already. The Americans then proceeded to occupy Greenland and Iceland. Greenland and Iceland, which had been, of course, part of the Danish Empire, if you want to call it that. But Denmark is now under the control of the Germans, and so we decided that rather than let the Germans slip in there, we'd better move first. Now, here was where the rub came. The Americans, once we had occupied Iceland, if you remember your map of the Atlantic, you will remember that that's halfway across the Atlantic. And the Americans announced to the Germans that we did not want any German submarines operating in the central or western Atlantic because we now claimed that was our sphere of influence. Now, the problem for the Germans was if they accept that, then any ship coming from America could get 2/3 of the way across the ocean before the German submarines could attack. And the consequence of that was that, of course, the British Navy, large fleet still, could concentrate in that area and quite possibly enable the English to get all the supplies they needed from America. Well, the Germans weren't going to buy that. So this sequence of events went something like this. When we made that announcement, the Germans, of course, rejected it, and we continued to send our destroyers out there. They still sent their submarines. What's bound to happen sooner or later, Jake?
We declare war on Germany.
Well, you're moving in the right direction. Their subs are out there. Our destroyers are out there.
They're going to have a confrontation.
Sooner or later, there's going to be a clash, and sure enough, it did. Tell them about it.
That's what I was going to say. That they were going to eventually have to start sinking American ships.
That's exactly right. Unless they break that American destroyer screen, then of course they could very easily see England reinforced to a considerable degree. They didn't want that. So in September they fired an American sub in the midst, an American destroyer in the midst. The destroyer tried to hit them with depth charges but did not succeed in sinking. Then in October, the 15th of October, the German subs hit one of our destroyers, killed 11 men, and it had to be towed into harbor. On October the 31st, this was Halloween with a vengeance, they sank their first American destroyer. And at this point in time then, obviously the Americans have their eyes glued on Europe. When was it going to can help you to understand that we were paying very little attention to what was happening. I'm talking about public opinion now. Public wasn't really watching much about what was happening in Asia. They were glued on this situation, and as Jake said, sooner or later, these exchanges would lead to either one power or the other declaring war. It was just a toss-up whether it would be us or whether it would be the Germans, because you can't be fighting an undeclared naval war and not own up to that fact. All right, let's leave that situation then. At the beginning then of December in 1941, the American government had come this far. They decided that they were not only going to continue to fight the German submarines, but they were going to arm our merchant ships. And send them into the war zone. I want to repeat that. We were going to arm our merchant ships and send them into the war zone. Now that's tantamount to a declaration of war right there, but it's not an official declaration of war. But that was not the way the war came. Let's switch back to the Pacific and wrap things up today. In the Pacific, the Japanese, as we told you earlier, had seized huge amounts of Chinese territory, but they could not knock China out of the war. So that war drags on. The second thing was that all through this period, and this may seem strange, that the Americans continued to send oil and scrap iron to Japan because, incredibly enough, neither Japan nor China had ever declared war on each other. It was referred to as the Chinese incident. It lasted 8 years, but it was never an official declaration of war. It was the incident. So therefore, under the Neutrality Act, we could continue to send material to both sides. Well, since the Japanese obviously had the biggest merchant marine and could bar the Chinese from coming over, it's incredible in retrospect that we spent several years there supplying the Japanese with what they had to have to carry on the war. And so it continues. All right. Now, in the summer of 1941, the Japanese had come to the conclusion that they were not going to be able to carry on this war much longer until they got definite supplies of oil for themselves. They had found none in the area they controlled in Manchuria or the rest of China. None of the other parts of the Japanese Empire controlled it, but there were two sources, known sources of oil at that time. One was in Burma, which was controlled by the British. The other one, of course, was in Indonesia, at that time controlled by Holland, or was called in those days the Dutch East Indies. Now there's a problem. To go get that oil, they're going to have to move their army way to the south, and that might incur American intervention. So they began to hash it over. They finally decided, well, what are we going to have to do? We're going to have to go get that oil, come what may. And so we will just have to run the risk of having a clash with the Americans. In fact, what we probably ought to do is take the Americans out first. And then there would be no problem about going down and taking the territory. Of course, Holland was already under German control. And it would seem to be a rather easy target if they can take the Americans out first. Now, that meant they've got to plan very carefully how they're going to pull this off. The man who when he first heard about it, was very concerned about it, was the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito. And Hirohito realized, he had visited the United States when he was still the Crown Prince. He was very concerned about what would happen. If the U.S. came into the war, he knew a good deal about the industrial prowess of the U.S., so he told the Japanese warlords, well, all right, I will not sign this imperial rescript for war unless you try to negotiate with the Americans. And so that's what the Japanese warlords agreed to do. All right, they would send another representative to Washington to consult with the United States. He would join the Japanese ambassador, and hopefully they'd be able to work things out. But this is an impossible deal. The Japanese were operating at that time on what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. I'll run that one by you one more time. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. We were still operating under the old open door policy. That would mean the only way they could satisfy us would be to pull their troops out of China and back off from these conquests they had made. Well, that's not going to be possible from the Japanese point of view. So the exchanges between the Japanese government and their representatives in Washington took on a very interesting turn. The Americans had broken the Japanese diplomatic code. They had broken the Japanese diplomatic code. The result was we were reading the mail, the instructions that were being sent to the Japanese negotiators. We knew what they were going to say before they said it, because we had intercepted the messages and we had the code broken so we could read it. I sometimes wonder why the Japanese negotiators, why they didn't wonder why was it that Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State, seemed to know what they were going to say before they said it. And as soon as they said it, he had a paper ready to hand right back to them. It should have tipped them off, but apparently it did not. They just, I guess, thought he was a quick thinker, and so they let it go at that. Now, the negotiations dragged on for a while, and the military said, all right, look, we're not making any progress over there. What we want to do is to send the U.S. one last message. And if they don't respond favorably to this, I love the way they phrased it, things will automatically begin to happen. Now, we broke that down. We realized that this was tantamount to a declaration of war, but not quite. There would be one final message, and it did come in. At the 1st of December, we got this quote-unquote final message from the from the Japanese, and it was pretty clear that if we didn't accept what was in that message, that, as I said, things would automatically begin to happen. Well, the Americans, but then there was one other thing, and this was really a tip-off also. The Japanese instructions were, if the Americans reject this final offer, you will pretend to continue to negotiate. You will continue to pretend to negotiate. Now that told us volumes right there. Why would you pretend to continue to negotiate if you know the negotiations are for all practical purposes at an end? What would be the reason for that? Well, we began to figure this one out. And we had decided then, we had already taken some very firm action to try to stop the Japanese. The Japanese decided to move into what we called at that time French Indochina. Remember, France now is under the control of the Germans, so they don't have much to say about this. Japanese occupied the northern half of Indochina. The American government was concerned about that, but the Japanese explanation was we need these bases to attack some of the remaining Chinese forces in southwestern China. We told them, if you move into the southern half of Indochina, we will cut off all trade. We will cut off all trade. Now this is very important to keep in mind. Where were they getting all their oil at that time? From the United States. If the United States then cut off trade with Japan, then that meant the Japanese war machine would grind to a halt within a year's time. Now, of course, you can see the die is cast. The Americans have made this point. The Japanese did not take our bluff. They proceeded to occupy the southern half of Indochina, which tipped off very clearly the Japanese were planning to attack in the direction of Malaysia, Burma, and Indonesia. At the same time, and actually a little before this, Roosevelt, in another desperate attempt to bluff them down, had transferred the U.S. Navy from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. From San Diego to Pearl Harbor. If he'd left it at San Diego, you kind of wonder how things might have been. But we won't get into that here. The Japanese now determined then to go ahead and attack. What they did, they took their carriers and sent them up to the northern island of Hokkaido. where they took on new crews, latest planes, etc. And this was the trick they played on us. None of you, I guess, have ever taken code on radio, da-da-da-did-it, da-da-da-did. They say, and I'll take their word for it, I was an aviation radioman in World War II. I certainly couldn't do this. But if you listen carefully, you can tell exactly who is sending each message. You can actually detect that they cannot disguise the way they send coded messages. And you can know who these people were. Well, the American intelligence thought we really had them zeroed in because we knew exactly the sound of every transmission from one of the Japanese carriers. There was just one problem. The Japanese knew we knew that. The result was they took all of their regular operators off their carriers, put other men on, and sailed in radio silence up to the northern island of Hokkaido. We are, of course, checking for Japanese. We knew there was a possibility of attack, but we were looking straight to the west, over toward Truk, where the Japanese had a large naval base. And we weren't finding anything out there. And since we heard nothing from the carriers, we assumed that these radio operators were still sending from there in Tokyo. They took these men off the ship and let them send on other ships there in Yokohama, and we did not know that the carriers had sailed. About 2 days before the attack on Pearl Harbor, one of our agents in Japan sent the word that the Japanese carriers were not in Yokohama. And when that word got to the American admiral at Pearl Harbor, he turned to his chief of intelligence and said, "You mean the Japanese carriers could be coming around Diamond Head?" That's right outside of Pearl Harbor. And the guy said, "Yes, that's possible. I don't know where they are. We've lost them entirely." Well, you already know what the story was. They were steaming across the North Pacific. Since we had cut trade ties with Japan, there were no ships up there. So they sailed without any sign of danger of discovery, and then they headed straight south. Now, the last item came the night of December the 6th. The Americans had listened very carefully to what the Japanese were saying. We knew this last message was probably going to be a declaration of war. And sure enough, we began to pick it up on the night of the 6th. We translated it, had broken the code, and we knew that this attack was probably coming. But one very crucial part of the message was going to be delivered the next morning. There were 12 parts that we already had, and we translated, and we knew what they were building up to. The 13th paragraph would be the declaration of war, but when was it going to be delivered? We did not know that. The next morning, on December the 7th, the 13th paragraph came in, and it was a declaration of war. Now, what intrigued our code people was it would be delivered to the American Secretary of State at 1:25 in the afternoon. Anybody see anything strange about this? Delivering it at 1:25 in the afternoon. I hear some mumbling out there. Anybody want to hazard a guess on this? Why would that seem strange to you? They would be delivered at 1:25 in the afternoon. This is a declaration of war. Jake? Jake says, "Beats me."
Because of the time change,
There was a very crucial element about time. You're absolutely right. We'll get right to that. Normally, if you're going to declare war on somebody, why don't you just take it in, 8:30 in the morning, lay it on the desk, and we're declaring war. Why would you wait until the early afternoon? Well, all right. They decided that they needed to get this message to the head of the Army, General George Marshall. And so they went to Marshall's office. The trouble was, and of course you run into this throughout this whole sad story, Marshall was out horseback riding. He did not like to be interrupted on his horseback ride. That was something he thoroughly enjoyed. And you just didn't bother George on his horseback ride. They waited till he got back to his office. Now, the minute he saw it, he immediately picked up on this time factor. He realized that 1:25 in the afternoon would be, of course, the morning in Pearl Harbor. So he urged them to send a message immediately warning the people in Japan. He did not know the Japanese were going to attack. I repeat, we had no idea where their carriers were, but they needed to be warned. They needed to be warned. And the result was that the message then got to San Francisco. It was supposed to go from San Francisco to Honolulu by radio. In other words, send code. Problem. Radio transmitters were not working that day because of atmospheric conditions. Nobody told the people in San Francisco how important this message was, so they said, well, this has happened before. We'll send it down and send it by civilian cable. And that's the way it went. But of course, when he got to Honolulu, it was in the hands of a bunch of civilians. They had no idea, because it was still in code, what the impact of this thing really was. They threw it in a basket and waited for a messenger to come out from the naval headquarters to pick it up later in the day. I think you know what happened in the interval. Okay, we will see you next time at that point. This time we'll go over those questions that you have, so be prepared to respond to that on Thursday. All right, you get it? Okay, good, good.